Any other questions before we kick off some learning today, folks? So here is your flow. So the goals for today, to get terms and foundations for the course knocked out, which is where we're going to start, and we'll get through that before we get to lunch. And then we get into the start of agency. And so like I was just telling Lene, when we get into agency, I'm probably not even going to show you slides for like the first 30 minutes. I'm probably just going to talk to you and explain things. Because I find that sometimes these slides provoke questions, and those questions provoke confusion. And so you'll find that sometimes I'm just like, screw the slides, let's just talk. Because I can help you understand it better, and then when I show you the slides, it's less daunting. So that is the plan. So let me pull these slides up. Also, be aware that these slides, sometimes Travis goes in and tweaks itty bitty little things. And so if you see something that's on my version but not on yours in Learn Test Pass, it may just be that he never uploaded it. The information is the same. The page count should be very similar. But if there's ever like a question of something you see on your slides that's not on mine, I'll provide some clarity on it. Because it does happen. My goal is just to make sure that you're comfortable with everything that we're talking about, whether or not it matches up to the slides exactly. You'll be well prepared. So, got the slides up. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to give you one more little piece of information, and then we're going to start talking about some material. Here's kind of my cautionary warning and just something that I want to explain to you really quick. If we go back to where is it? Your syllabus. I want to explain one more thing, just so it doesn't throw you off. If you're dealing with pre-licensing, most often it is taught chronologically based on the syllabus. So if you look, most of the time the class goes basic real estate concepts, then property ownerships and interest, then property taxation and assessment, transfer of title to real property, so on and so forth. But here's the thing. At one point, Travis decided to change things up and teach it in a different order. And I told him that I had the stones to try it as well, and so this is what him and I have been doing. And so let me explain the flow of things. We're going to go over some introduction concepts today. But where we're starting is actually right here, okay? Brokerage relationships, laws, and practice. We get into the agency stuff. That's normally about halfway through the class. And so here's the reason why. It is one of the most testable concepts. It is one of the most confusing concepts. And so, kind of like one of y'all mentioned earlier, we're just going to rip that Band-Aid. We're going to start off there because if we introduce it now, that means that you're going to hear it a lot more throughout the course and you're going to retain it better. Some of the other concepts are what I like to call flashcard level concepts, where it's just memorization of, this is what this is what that is. Agency is not a flashcard concept. It's an analytical concept. It's a distinguish and differentiate. You got to be able to write a book on it in order to test appropriately. So that's why we're starting it so early. So here's the other thing that I have to tell you. If you watch Travis's videos, Travis and I have kind of a different approach in one very specific thing. I believe in giving you all the information up front. And the reason being, if I teach you one thing but then add something to it later, I just feel like you have a tendency to get confused, right? Because if I give you a partial truth and then the whole truth later, it gets confusing. And Travis likes to do that, right? Travis gives you he lets you nibble at something and then we'll give you the whole thing to eat later. I like to give it to you the way that it's supposed to be given to you right up front, which is going to be a little more daunting. But I think for consistency and repetition purposes, you'll appreciate it because then you'll hear it over and over again exactly like it's supposed to be. The other thing that you have to understand is the way that we're teaching this course is going to require what I call mini lessons. Because I'll get into certain concepts and certain maths, and it's going to reference something that we normally would have already gone over, but we haven't because of the order we're going in. And so I will give you a mini lesson on a concept, enough to get you by, and then we'll have the full concept circled back around. Does that make sense? So for example, I'll give you the most common example here. When we get into like agency and we start talking about contracts and sales contracts, we're going to talk about something called excise tax. Well, excise tax, normally comes up in transfer of title to real property because it's also called transfer tax or revenue stamps. So it's something that's paid when we transfer title. The way that we're teaching this, transfer of title to real property, is not one of the first concepts. It's one of the last concepts we're going to teach you. So I have to give you a mini lesson on excise tax and some of these transference things. And so we'll get these mini lessons throughout. And I'll announce them. I'll say, hey, this is a mini lesson, but we're going to talk about this in great detail when we get to this section. Does that make sense for everybody? So let's start with some basic vocabulary and terminology. Even though we're going in kind of a unique order, there's still some terms that I want to talk to you about that I want to explain to you. And the vocabulary can be god-awful because it is very testable. And there are so many things that have similar names. I've already given you an example of the nuances between broker and realtor and agent. Well, there's also broker, full broker, and non-provisional broker. There is qualified fee and defeasible fee, which means the same thing, right? There's so many things that mean the same thing. And so you'll hear me use a lot of these terminologies, and I have to. If I'm not repeating them, they're not sticking in your head. So we need to kind of start there. The terminology stuff, flashcard level in most cases, and we'll talk about that. But let's lay some basic knowledge, all right? Here's another example of when you might hear things interchangeable. Land, real estate, real property. If you've heard any of those terms, a lot of people will use those interchangeably. There are nuances to those terminologies, though. If we just say land, folks, if you look outside and you think about what's underneath you, right? Dirt, right? That's what most people think of for land. But for us in real estate, when we say land or ownership of land, it's not just the dirt you see. That's the most common thing that people think of. But when you own land, you're actually said to own everything below the earth's surface and everything above the earth's surface. So what we call subsurface rights and air rights. So land ownership includes everything below and everything above. Well, then if we go from land to what we call real estate or realty, it would be the land plus everything attached to the land, both man-made and natural. Your trees, your fences, your houses, your patios, your sidewalks. Excuse me, that's what we call real estate, okay? So when you're said to own real estate, you own everything below the land, everything above it, all the attachments there too, okay? So that is kind of the nuance between land and real estate. Now I'll tell you this too. There is another terminology, the most common, the most prevalent, is what we call real property. Even though you may not use that a lot in your day-to-day life, we do a lot in this class, real property. And all real property is real estate. So in other words, the land, everything below the land, everything above, all the attachments there too, and then what we call the bundle of legal rights. There are rights that you have when you own real estate. And with those bundle of legal rights being transferred to you as well, we call that real property. So real property is just all of these things, plus this bundle of legal rights. And we're going to get into the bundle of legal rights later, but let me just explain them to you briefly. The acronym, which will come up on later slides, is DEEP C. The letter C, not the word C. Deep sea. So it sounds like deep sea fishing, but it is DEEPC. And those are the right of disposition. I'm not going to write all this out. It's going to pop up in later slides. Disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control. Disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control. And let me just give you kind of like a really basic real estate concept lesson here. If you own property, real property, and you own this bundle of legal rights, disposition means you have the right to get rid of it. To dispose of, right? It's in the name. Well, you don't typically throw real property in the trash. What do? You sell it, you gift it, you will it. So having the right of disposition. Thank you, Becky. So much better. Becky put them in the chat for me because I'm like writing with a mouse. I'm like, this is going to take a while. I can't do that. Disposition is the right to dispose of it. Okay. Exclusion. Get off my lawn, you dang kids, right? You got the right to put a no trespassing sign in your yard and not let anybody come in. Okay. Right of exclusion. You can exclude other people from being on your property. Right of enjoyment. That's kind of an ironic term. Most people, right, you know what enjoyment means, but when we talk about real estate or real property, it doesn't mean you're just sitting in your house saying, this is nice, right? I'm enjoying this. This is great, right? That's not the kind of enjoyment we're talking about. Enjoyment is actually what we call quiet enjoyment. In other words, nobody can claim superior title. Nobody can come forward and say they own your property more than you own your property. That's what enjoyment is. Possession means you're actually occupying it. And then control is control of the property and the proceeds or the profits. If you want to build a farm and sell livestock, you can control that and you can get paid for it. But let me just give you an example of these things. Understand that in real estate, one of the biggest things to understand, we have defaults. But then you also have to understand that everything is negotiable in real estate. And so this bundle of legal rights could be severed off. Let me give you the most common example. If you're renting a house right now, you don't own it. Somebody else owns it. You agree? But you know what you've purchased? You have purchased the right of possession and the right of exclusion. We can all agree that if you're renting, the person who owns that property can't kick the door in and come in and be like, I need to borrow some milk for my Cheerios. I'm out, right? They can't just barge into your house. Even though they legally own the house, they have given you, as a tenant, the right of possession, meaning you're occupying it, and the right of exclusion, meaning you control who comes in and who comes out. So these bundle of legal rights can be severed. They can be separated from each other. They can be given to somebody else and then they can be given back. That's how real estate works. We can all agree that if you're renting a house, you do not have the right of disposition. You can't sell the house, right? You can't claim superior title to the house. Somebody else is the title owner. And you may have some level of C, control, but your landlord could also say, no growing pot in the backyard, and then then you're not really able to do what you want to do. I don't know. So, land versus real estate versus real property. And these are going to come up again in much later sections. This is just the foundational knowledge, okay?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
You would also have right of enjoyment as a renter as well, correct?
So remember, enjoyment is kind of one of those confusing topics because everybody thinks it means one thing, but the best way to think of enjoyment is nobody can come and claim superior title. That's what it means. So like when we're talking about ownership, right? Quiet enjoyment means if I own my property, Lene, you can't come up and say, no, I own it. And so enjoyment is more about ownership than anything. And so you wouldn't really have quiet enjoyment. It's kind of one of those, it's a farce, if you will. It doesn't mean what it sounds like it means, right? Kind of a misnomer. Yeah. So here's where we got into some of the brokerage activities, and this doesn't quite flow as well as what I said, right? When we're talking about real estate activities, it was that LL Beans. List, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, sale. So this is the list. It's just not in a very pretty format, right? It should be list, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, and sale. Those are brokerage activities. So if you're ever doing any of these things, referring somebody, offering to do these things, right? And it involves real property for others for compensation, a license is required. And it is all three of those things, okay? Real property for others for compensation. If you help somebody sell a house but didn't get paid, you don't need a license. If you help somebody lease a house but didn't get paid, you don't need a license. If you did it for yourself, you don't need a license, right? So the question you're always asking is it real property? Is it for others? And are you getting compensated? And if all three of those are yes, then you need a license in most cases. And we'll get into some nuances and some exemptions down the road. This is the general rule of thumb for when a license is required, a broker's license or a firm license. List, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, sale. License required. Real property for others for compensation. So let me give you an example of this, okay? You folks right now are not licensees. I am. So if you called me up after class and you said, hey Seth, by the way, my mama wants to buy a house in your area, would you help her? That would be sending me business. And it's what we would call a referral in most circumstances. But here's the thing. A referral, if your mama wants to buy, we can all agree buying is an LL Beans activity. And you referring somebody to buy would be a brokerage activity if you got compensated for it. So here's what I'm trying to get at. If I paid any of you folks for sending me your mama, that's a legal brokerage activity. Because I paid you as an unlicensed person for referring somebody to buy, right? Buy real property for others and you got compensated for it. So that would be a legal brokerage activity. Now, if you all were licensees, meaning you got your license and you sent me your mama because you lived in a different area than me, I could pay you now because you are licensed. That's what that license does. It allows you to do brokerage activity, right? Dealing with real property for others for compensation legally. So the rules are very specific, and that's highly testable on the North Carolina side, but we're going to get into that in more detail down the road, okay? The different ways that you need a license, the exemptions for when you don't need a license, right? Because there's some, they're testable. I'm just giving you a couple examples here. Let me give you one more example. If you had your Nana, the sweet, sweet lady that Nana is, and Nana had that Duck Beach house, right? That beach house over in Duck, like $6 million beach house or whatever it is, okay? And it's Nana's beach house. Kelly, was it you that's managing those? Is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Okay, so Kelly, let's say that it's your Nana's beach house, okay? And Nana wants you to manage her beach houses, Kelly. Well, here's the thing, folks. If Nana asks Kelly to manage her beach houses, and Kelly does it because she loves her sweet, sweet Nana, Kelly doesn't need a license if she's not getting paid. But if Nana says, Kelly, you've done such a good job leasing Nana's beach houses. I want you and your friends to stay in this $10 million beach house for 2 weeks. Here's what you have to understand. Are we dealing with real property? Is that house real property? Uh-huh. Is Nana somebody else other than Kelly? Uh-huh. Is staying in a $10 million beach house something of value? So was Kelly compensated? Real property for others for compensation. Kelly would need a license to stay there legally. If Kelly stayed in that beach house, she committed a legal brokerage activity because she is unlicensed. Okay? Real property for others for compensation. It doesn't have anything to do with if they're family or not. That's the biggest misconception. Folks, your mama, your dad, your sister, your brother, your auntie, your uncle, your nephew, they're all other people. They may be family, but they're not you, right? Real property for others for compensation. License is required.
No gifting, that would be a legal activity. That wouldn't be considered a gift, right?
No, I mean, a gift would be something of value. Yeah. Now, I mean, if you weren't leasing Nana's property and Nana just wanted to let you stay in that beach house, that's completely legal. But if you're doing activities that constitute brokerage and getting something of value for it, that's illegal. Yeah.
Quick question. So it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be something, anything of
Anything of value.
Nana says you can have my car in exchange. Like,
Yes.
as long as it's something of value.
Anything of value. If Nana gives you a gift card, if Nana gives you cash, if Nana gives you use of her car, if Nana gives you a car, anything of value. That's exactly right. There you go. $1, a week at the beach, gift card, Hyundai. Hyundai. I like it. So when we're dealing with a license, folks, what is a license? A license is what you find folks are endeavoring to get. Now, here's the thing. We call people with a license a lot of different things. And the most common thing that you will hear me call them is licensees. Because that is just a very neutral, run-of-the-mill term for, somebody with a license, a broker's license. In North Carolina, I told you we also call you a broker. But depending on your status, you could be a provisional broker, you could be a full broker, you could be a broker in charge. But a license, I told you, the license is what you need to do real property for others for compensation. Folks, that's what you're trying to do. Help people do brokerage activities and get paid to do it. You need a license. And just like you find folks need a people license, I told you that a company, an entity, would need a firm license. Because Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, they're all doing brokerage activity. They're helping people buy and sell and lease and do all these LO Beans activities. And it's real property for others and they're getting paid for it. So entities need firm licenses and people need people licenses, called a broker's license. And that's what y'all are working towards, getting that license.
So entity licenses are different. So we have to go for a separate licensing for that entity itself.
Here's the funny thing about this, Sandeep. It's not quite, we're not quite there yet, but let me go ahead and explain this to you. Do you think it's possible for Coldwell Banker to sit in this classroom like y'all are sitting in this classroom?
No.
No. And so when we're talking about a firm license, it's a special application, but what allows an entity to get a license is the broker. You having a license and being an owner of an entity, and as long as you meet certain criteria, can get a firm license for your entity. So it's just a matter of creating the entity the right way, applying for a firm license, and you being what we call the qualifying broker. The broker that qualifies this entity for a license. And then some entities also need BICs, and some entities do not. And I'll tell you, there's a nuance in that topic that is not really important for you as a pre-licensing student, but there's another part that is. So, and we're going to talk about that. So it's just a different application for it and a different license, not a separate course.
Okay. Got it.
Yep, good question. So we've already talked about this. I'm not going to go into crazy detail here. This is the minimum licensing requirements, all right? Legal age, right? 18, U.S. citizen, social security number, valid to work in the U.S., all that jazz. And so here's just a couple examples like we've been talking about. If you're working for yourself, selling your own property, no license needed. If you're leasing your own property, no license is needed. Working for others without compensation, no license needed. Working for others and charging a fee, license would be required because then we're dealing with real property for others for compensation. Got to have a license. Now, understand there are some exceptions to this rule. And just out of curiosity, Kelly, explain to me your dynamic. And please understand, I'm not going after anybody from like a commission point of view. So I'm just curious as to because you're doing property management right now, yes?
Correct. I am. So being on the guest side of things, they want all of the assistant managers to have that license so that when we are moving these guests outside of our company and we have to deal with compensation issues, anything like that. We're able to help them to negotiate with the other companies that we're trying to move them to, going to the homeowner and presenting them with a negotiated rate from a guest. So in my position there, dealing with the guest owners, I'm going to kind of be that bridge between, hopefully, with this license so I can negotiate those things.
And so you work for a broker right now, a broker property manager?
Correct.
It's perfect. And so, folks, that is one of the exemptions we're going to talk about in this class. Kelly is an exemption because a employee of a broker property manager can do certain things. That involves showing people properties for lease, showing them lease agreements, pre-printed lease agreements, and having them sign them, telling them about the schedule of rents for vacation rentals, handling security deposits, handling rents, and all that stuff. So Kelly would be an exemption. So we're going to talk about there's 9 exemptions named in the License on Commission Rules of North Carolina, and a salaried employee or W-2 employee of a broker property manager is allowed to do quite a few things, not full brokerage activity. So Kelly could not do, showing properties for sale, right? Kelly can't do all LL Bean's activities. She can just assist in some of the leasing activities, just some of them. And we'll talk more about that in great detail. So there are exemptions, but the general rule of thumb, working for others, dealing with real property, and getting paid, license is required under most circumstances. So this goes back to the entities. When I say entity, folks, companies is what we're talking about. Limited liability companies called LLCs, corporations, partnerships, nonprofits. All of these are entities that are created with the Secretary of State. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But in order to stay on track, I'm going to leave this slide up. And I'm going to send you to lunch now because it is 12 o'clock. It's 11:59 on my end. So 12 o'clock to 12:45. If you have to sign out, it's not the end of the world. But if you can, just stay logged in. It's just easier for attendance purposes. But you can turn your camera off. Y'all go have your lunch break, 12 o'clock, 12:45. Eat some Wheaties, get some brain food, and then we'll come back and we'll keep rocking and rolling at 12:45. Have a lovely lunch. So let's pick back up where we left off. Talking about some of these foundational concepts, and so we talked about licenses and activities that need a license. And remember, I told you there are companies, it's called entities that exist that are doing brokerage activity. And in order for them to be able to do it legally, they also have to have a license. So they get a thing license called a firm license, whereas individuals that are people get people licenses called a broker's license. So when we're dealing with people versus firms, here's just an example of that. Trav Talks is the name of our school, but it is also the name of a brokerage firm that Travis utilizes. So he created this firm, and this firm required a firm license. Individual licensees need broker's licenses. So there's firm licenses and broker's licenses. Broker's licenses for the people, firm licenses for the entity or the thing. Now, I want to talk about a very important foundational concept before we even get into agency while we're talking about this, okay? I want you to understand that it is possible. By the way, there's 2 cameras still not on, so make sure you get your cameras on. If you forget, it's getting counted against you. I think I how to word this. There is 2 possible ways for brokerage activity to happen under most circumstances, okay? People that have broker's licenses that meet certain criteria can do real estate by themselves. And we call that, in a lot of cases, a sole proprietorship. You may also see the term sole practitioner. It is a person who does business in their name. And for us, the business that we're in is real estate. And so somebody who is not a member of a Keller Williams, Coldwell Banker, or a Century 21, but because they have certain authorities under license law, they could operate independently. And so I am in a position where I have that authority. I could go out today and I could do brokerage activities without a firm, just in the name of Seth Chauncey, right? That would be an individual sole proprietorship. But there is also these entities that we're talking about. And I already told you, you folks are going to get your license issued on what we call provisional and inactive status. And you can't play real estate unless you have a broker in charge and or a firm. Okay? More specifically, it's the broker in charge you need, and I'll explain that in just a second. So I want you to understand something. Even though we're differentiating between people and things, right? Entities. We treat entities like people. Can you all agree that Microsoft could own a house? Sure. Microsoft isn't a person, but it has the ability to buy a house. It has the ability to have stock options. It has the ability to sell stuff. And, they can do everything that a person can do. And here's the reason why this is so important. So here's your first big concept with an agency. It is possible for people to work with a real estate firm and an individual licensee acting as a sole proprietor. But I told you, in real estate, and in this class especially, you always need to have a default in mind. What we default to. Because the default is always a very testable concept. I told you, there's no absolutes in real estate. But there is a default, a most common circumstance. So the most common relationship is with a firm. So if we give you, in a test question, in any way, shape, or form, if we give you a relationship, right? Such and such is working with such and such, right? The default is a brokerage firm. And here's why this is so important, okay? I'm gonna tell you something here, so listen to me carefully. Once you all get your licenses, let's say that every single one of you affiliated with ABC Realty, let's use a generic name. If your best friend was to call you and say, I'd like to buy a house, when there is a firm, they are hiring the firm, not you. That is a very important concept to understand because it will absolutely be important in the way of test taking and test answering. So in other words, if every single one of you were licensed right now and you all worked for ABC Realty, if Talia's best friend called her and says, Talia, I want to buy a house, Talia's best friend just hired ABC Realty, not technically Talia. If Sandeep's best friend called and said, I want to buy a house, they just hired Sandeep's firm, not Sandeep, ABC Realty. This is incredibly important, especially when we get into a deeper concept of agency called dual agency. So you always need to be paying very close attention to, are we talking about a sole proprietor or a firm? And if we're talking about, if we don't say the word sole proprietor, it's going to default to firm. Firm is a relationship that you should automatically go to. And when we're dealing with a firm, understand that even the word firm isn't an absolute. Folks, do you have any idea how many agents work for ABC Realty at any given time? You don't. It doesn't matter if I say Keller Williams, Coldwell Banker, it doesn't matter. The point is, you could have a firm that only has one person. You could have a firm that has two people. And you've got to pay very careful attention to these nuances in these agency relationships. Is it talking about a firm versus an individual? Is it talking about specific licensees within a firm? So on and so forth. So the thing that exists with a firm is an entity. That is the only way to know if there is a firm, is whether or not an entity has been created. That corporation, that LLC, that general partnership, so on and so forth. That's what makes something a firm, because we've created an entity with the Secretary of State. But somebody who is just doing brokerage because they meet the criteria in their own name, never created an entity, that's not a firm. That's what we call a sole proprietorship. So, here's where we're going with what I just kind of said. If the broker isn't doing business as a firm, then what are they? I just told you, firms is the most common default. That's what we're going to default to in almost every question. But if we tell you that it's not a firm, if it's something else, the only other thing it could be is what we call a sole proprietor. also sometimes referred to as a sole practitioner. And the question changes vastly if you're answering agency relationship questions about a sole proprietor or if you're answering agency relationship questions about a firm. And that'll make more sense in the future. I'm just kind of laying some foundational stuff here. So, let me kind of throw in the most interesting piece into the mix in regard to this topic. If I was to put this lovely fellow right here in front of you, and I said, just by looking at him, is this a sole proprietor or a firm?
It could be either of those.
Could be either. This gentleman right here could meet the qualifications and be a sole proprietor working and doing brokerage in his own name with his broker's license. He could have also potentially created an entity and have a firm and a firm license and also be the BIC of that firm. It is possible for a firm to have only one person. It is possible for a firm to have two people. It's not about the people. It's about the setup. It's about the relationship. Because if you've created something with the Secretary of State called an entity, you would be considered a firm. But if you're operating with just your people license, your broker license under certain criteria that we'll talk about later, that would be a sole proprietorship because you're operating in your name. You've not created a separate entity. Everybody with me so far? Now don't worry, there's no pictures of like one-off people like this in the test where it's like, is this a silver? Like we couldn't do that. I'm just trying to validate a point here that you need some information to determine whether or not it's a firm or a sole proprietor. Conversely, if you look here, you think this is a firm or a sole proprietor?
Oh,
Well,
maybe firm.
So here's where I'm going to throw you the biggest curveball. Could be either. Let me explain. I told you that you need a BIC or firm when you get your license as a provisional broker to play real estate. Well, here's where let me introduce how sole proprietors can get tricky. I have the ability to be a sole proprietor right now because I am a BIC. And so I can do everything that a firm can do in my own name. I don't need Coldwell Banker. I don't need Century 21. I don't need any of those. Here's the kicker. I could also affiliate other licensees under me. So as soon as all of you got your license, you could all be affiliated with Seth Chauncey's sole proprietor, as opposed to affiliating with EXP, ABC, XYZ, doesn't matter. Because what you really need is a BIC, and if I'm a BIC, you can affiliate with me. Does that make sense? So it's tricky, but I will tell you this. From a test question point of view, even though I just showed you this curve, most of the time when we're dealing with a sole proprietorship for pre-licensing, it is just talking about one person by themselves. If I was doing business by myself, that's the most common questions you're going to get about sole proprietorships. Could I have agents affiliated under me under a sole proprietorship? Sure I could, as long as I met the criteria. The only difference between a sole proprietorship is you're using a broker's license and doing business in your own name as a sole proprietorship, and an entity, excuse me, a firm license, you've created an entity and you're doing brokerage in the name of that entity, not your own license. You need a separate firm license for that. And it's going to make more sense down the road when I give you some more examples of agency and these relationships. I just want to make sure that you're following along because the default is think real estate firm. Okay? If we don't say the word sole proprietor, think real estate firm. And remember what I told you about firms. Doesn't matter if the licensee is really irrelevant if it's a firm question. In most cases, it's about the firm's relationship with the client. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So, let me give you another big piece, and this is kind of out of place, but because we're talking about terminologies, I'm going to go ahead and give you this because we're going to get into the agency concepts. Any of you fine folks go and get your hair did on a regular basis, right? You go and get, color, touch up, or, perm or whatever. You got a person that you go to? Most of you probably, right? Corbin's like, nah, dog, I shave my own head. What you talking about? All right? He's like, I just get them clippers out. It's all right. It's okay if you don't have a person. But here's the thing. If you have a person, whether you go to a barber, a beautician, and whatever, okay? If you walked into their shop, and I'm making a very important point here. If you walked into their shop for your appointment, and they say, oh, look at you. There you are. You are my favorite customer. I'm so happy to see you. It's okay for them to say that, right? This isn't a trick question. It's absolutely okay for them to say that. I'm not trying to trick you. I will try to trick you in the future. Some of y'all are like already real nervous about what I'm trying to get at here, right? Like, I don't trust this man because he's tricking us. I am, but I'm not. It's not a trick question, but there is a lesson here. I'm going to say something else now. So you walk in there and they say, oh, there's my favorite customer. I'm so excited to see you. Well, what if instead they said, oh, there's my favorite client. I'm so happy to see you. Does that hold any different weight to you?
No. Those are different things, client and customer.
Are they? If you're going to get your hair done, is there any difference? You're both, aren't you? You're a client, you're a customer. They can call you whatever the hell they want. You agree?
Kind of, but if I'm his client, it's basically because I'm paying him for doing the haircut instead of the customer that I'm just there, but I can cut my hair with anyone else.
Well, and in my scenario, it was your person, right? You're going to that person, that same person. And if they called you a customer or a client, most of us don't bat an eyelash at either. You agree?
Most of the time, but a customer
Oh,
makes it seem like they work for somebody else. Client, they work for themselves.
yeah. Here's the thing. In the regular world, nobody's differentiating between client and customer. I mean, really and truthfully, they're not. I mean, you can have a percent, but if you've got an attorney, right, and they called you, client or customer, you don't care what they call you, do you? You know that they're helping you. You know that they're working. The point I'm trying to make is, for most of you, those words don't hold any different weight. But here's the thing I need you to understand. In real estate, they hold vastly different weights. The word client versus the word customer are night and day. The word client and the word customer are exact opposites. They do not mean the same thing in real estate. And so if you see a question that talks about a customer, or you see a question that talks about a client, those are going to be vastly different answers. You have to disassociate those. They do not hold the same weight in real estate. A client is somebody we're actually looking out for when we get into these agency and these fiduciary duties. A customer is nobody. We don't care nothing about customers. And it's borderline the opposite, right? We're actually going to take a customer to the cleaners. We are going to take advantage of customers. Now, there's going to be some concepts that I teach you in this class, and you're going to be like, oh my God, that doesn't sound right. Don't care. It is what it is. I have to teach you. You can't have a bleeding heart. When I teach you some of these things, you're like, well, I don't think that's fair. I don't care. The way that we wrote this, the way that the rules get, we have to draw a line in the sand. You with me? And if you think about what you would ethically do versus what I'm telling you you have to do, you're going to get the question wrong. So a client and a customer are vastly different. We take care of clients. We don't care about customers. Now I'll go ahead and tell you the other name for a client. We also call a client a principal. Those do mean the same thing in our world. Client and principal. So now that I've introduced those terminologies, let me introduce a few more. Okay, when we're talking about people that we work with and people that we're helping, right? There's times where you may be working with a customer, but kind of like what Catherine said, working with, not working for, right? Working with, not working for. We can all agree that, let's go back to that hair analogy, because y'all were onto something. I just needed you to have the separation of, most of the time we don't differentiate. But like Andres and Catherine were saying, if you go back to that hair place, and your beautician is currently doing somebody's hair, isn't it possible that another beautician will come up and check you in and help you out, right? Even though it's not your person, they may assist you with something. And we do that too in real estate. Okay, we may be assisting somebody that's not our person just because we have to, get it to somewhere that it needs to be. So I'm going to leave that concept at that for a minute. So when we're dealing with other terminologies for what we call people, things in our world, we've got a lot of very specific real estate verbiage. And a lot of them end with or and e. And before I even show you the words, or, I want you to think give or. E, I want you to think receive e. So or think give or, e think receive e. And here's what I mean. If you are granting somebody ownership of real property, we call you the grantor because you're giving them ownership, right? Grantor. If you're receiving that ownership, we call you the grantee because you're receiving that ownership. If we talk about things like offers, the person who gives the offer is the offeror. The person who receives an offer is called an offeree. And there are quite a few pieces of terminology where we use these ors and e's in the real estate world. I'm going to show you a list in just a second. But for or, right, think give or. For e, think receive e. Sometimes it's not appropriate to just use the word buyers and sellers because there are times that a buyer and or a seller could be a grantor, and it's time specific. So we would tell you that this person's the grantor and the other person's the grantee, not necessarily the buyer or the seller, because they're not mutually exclusive, that one is always the grantor, one is always the grantee, one is always the offeror, one is always the offeree. There is a default, there's the most common, but it's not absolute. So offeror, offeree, one of the examples I just gave you, sendor, sendee, okay? Lessor, lessee, mortgagor, mortgagee. It's always thinking about who's giving and who's receiving. And so let's give you an example that you can kind of associate with, the real world. If we're dealing with leases, we've got somebody who owns real property and somebody who's renting real property. And so what happens is the person who owns real property gives a lease to the tenant. So if you think about that relationship, what would the landlord be? The lessor or the lessee?
Lesser.
Lesser.
The lessor. Because they gave them the lease, right? The or is the giver. So the landlord is the lessor, which would make a tenant the what?
The leasing.
There you go, the lessee, because they've gotten the lease. It was given to them. They received it. Okay, so or is the give or, e is the receive e. Now, let me throw at you one of the most confusing misnomers in this industry that is you're just going to hate this. Okay, if you look, here's a list, and I'm not going to go over these in all great detail because they're going to come up in their own respective times. But folks, when you own a home, what do you call that monthly payment that you make?
Mortgage.
Mortgage. That is the world's biggest misnomer. You do not pay a mortgage. And some of you are like, huh? Here's the thing. I told you, you're going to have to forget some things you know. A mortgage is a type of security instrument that is a lien on real property used in lien theory states, which North Carolina is not. We don't have a single mortgage in North Carolina. But that's what everybody calls their home loan payment, is a mortgage. So if you had to look at this between mortgagor and mortgagee, and I told you to guess who is a mortgagor and mortgagee, you're going to guess wrong. I promise you are. Because the person who borrows the money, the buyer, is the mortgagor. And the bank is the mortgagee. And let me explain. What you got from the bank was a loan. You got money from them. But in a lien theory state, you give them the mortgage, which is pledging your home as collateral for the debt. And so the borrower is the mortgagor, and the bank is the mortgagee. You now starting to get a feel for what I mean when I say you have to unlearn some things that you thought you knew? Because we don't have mortgages in North Carolina. That's a misnomer. You have a home loan. And your security instrument in North Carolina is called a deed of trust, which we'll talk about that down the road. But that's one of the most confusing ones, which is why I like to give emphasis on that. Mortgagor and mortgagee. The borrower is the mortgagor because you're giving a mortgage to the bank, pledging your home as collateral for the debt, the money that you borrowed. And so they are the ones receiving the mortgage from you, this pledge of collateral. It's a security instrument. Grantor, grantee, that's conveying ownership, lessor, lessee, right? Lessor is the landlord, lessee is the tenant. We just talked about that one. Offeror, offeree deals with options. Offeror, offeree deals with offers. Then we've got the optionor and the optionee, which deals with options. The optionor would be the person who gave you the option. The optionee would be the person who received the option. And we'll talk about option to purchase contracts later. The trustor, trustee, we'll talk about trust. I don't want to get into all of these yet, but we will. I wanted to talk about the big ones that are going to be more confusing right now. But these are all of our or and e words, right? All of our or and e words, because we have a lot of them. Remember, give or, right? The or is the give or, the e is the receivee. So, that being said, let's kick off some agency. That was just a little framework, some foundational terminology. Now we got to get into some agency. Now here's what I'm probably going to do. I'm just going to talk to you for a minute, okay? I'm just gonna talk to you, and I'm just gonna matter of factly, like we're old buddies, just having a chit chatty conversation, explain agency to you. All right. I'm gonna give you some groundwork, some things to consider, some I'm gonna actually download this new slide. It may look a little different, but it looks like Travis updated one not that long ago. And so I'm gonna use that one and we'll see how it differs from y'all. So, let me just talk at you for a minute. Before I introduce any concepts, I'm just going to give you agency in a nutshell. And I think it's important, and here's why. Yet again, you have this predetermined notion in your head on agency and what your agent did and when you bought a house or what you've seen on HGTV or this, that, and the other. But I need to just lay some framework before we get there, okay? I want you to picture this, okay? I'm going to give you some story time. Once upon a time, real estate was very different than the way it is now. And what I mean by that is that everybody worked for sellers, people who own real property. And real estate was also a very mom and pop kind of business. So, what would happen is somebody had a home that they needed to sell. They would call a real estate broker, and that real estate broker would list the home, market the home, try to find a buyer, okay? But there was no such thing as buyer's agency, okay? If you've heard that term before, that didn't exist at this point. So every agent worked for the seller because the sellers were the ones that were making money. They're the ones that could pay people. And so let me just explain how this went on. If I had a home that I was hired to sell, for instance, Jody had a home, right? And so Jody calls me up. She says, Seth, I need to sell my home. I say, great, Jody, I've got you. So Jody and I would negotiate, and I'd say, well, Jody, I'm going to market, I'm going to find you a buyer, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and, I'm going to charge Jody 6%. And don't worry about the number, right? Everybody worries about the number. Don't worry about the number. I'm just saying, I'm charging Jody 6%. And so I'm going to put out ads in the newspaper, right? This is before the internet, by the way. Okay, so I'm going to put out ads in newspaper and print and word of mouth, and I'm going to do these random pieces of advertising, and I'm going to have buyers. And so random people would contact me, and then I would show them Jody's home, and when they wanted to buy it, I would write up an offer. Folks, you can all agree that I'll use the term listing agent, but when I say listing agent, a listing agent represents the seller. Okay, it's seller representation. Your loyalties are to the seller. And we're going to talk about these loyalties. So when I talk about being Jody's listing agent, I'm looking out for Jody. So if Sheena was the buyer, we can all agree that my job is to sell the home for Jody and make Jody some money. Well, I probably wrote up an offer for Sheena, but I didn't work for Sheena, right? That goes back to sometimes we assist people that are not our people. And so what we would call Sheena is a customer because I have no relationship with Sheena. I have a relationship with Jody because I work for Jody. Everybody following along so far? And this is just the way that it worked for a very long time. I helped Sheena write up an offer. I wrote one up for Sheena, and Jody accepted it. And then we got, to closing, and Jody got her money. And then Jody paid me my 6%, and we went on our merry way. Sheena just was at her own devices, right? Nobody was really looking out for her. If she wanted to buy the house, that's the way that it worked. And this continued for a very long time. And then what happened is, let's say I got another listing, okay? Lydia calls me up. And Lydia has a house to sell. And so I do the same thing with Lydia. I'm representing Lydia. I'm working for Lydia, and I'm helping her list her home and sell it. Okay? And then Dylan comes along. And I show Dylan the house. Dylan's a buyer, and he's like, Seth, man, hey, this house is great, but it's not quite what I was looking for. I was looking for something that had this, that, and the other. I'm like, well, dang, right? And I thought about it while Dylan and I are standing in Lydia's house. I thought about it. Johnny, who's another real estate agent, he has a listing down the road that matches what Dylan was looking for to a T. But remember, we all work for the sellers. It's our job to find buyers. But I got a little froggy, okay? And I picked up the phone and I called Johnny. I said, Johnny, hey, listen up. I got a buyer who I just showed my listing, and they didn't like it. But I think they'd really like your listing. Johnny says, great, send them over. I said, well, hold up there, Johnny. Listen, since you wouldn't have had this buyer if it weren't for me, why don't you give me a little something, something, Johnny, for sending him your way? If he buys this house, why don't you pay me a little something? Johnny's like, well, how much you thinking? I said, I don't know. All of it? And Johnny says, go to hell. Right? I said, all right, Johnny. How about 25%? He's all right, fine, whatever, Seth. If this works out, I'll pay you, okay? And so I send Dylan over to Johnny. Johnny shows him this house. Dylan loves it. Dylan buys it. Johnny closes the deal. So Johnny made 6%, but then he sends me a check for 25% of that 6%, or whatever it may be, right? Just an amount. And so I did nothing, folks, and I just got some mailbox money. I'm like, oof, that was sweet, right? Because I just made money off of something that I normally wouldn't have made any money on. Because I didn't sell my house, but I helped Johnny sell his. Folks, this is kind of the introduction of a referral, okay? Well, let's keep going here, all right? We do this for a while, and then we get to the point, right, where I list another house, okay? And this time I'm listing Heather's house. And same thing happens. I can't, I get a buyer. Douglas is my buyer, okay? And Douglas doesn't like Heather's house. So I pick up the phone and I call Claire. I say, Claire, hey, listen, you knew this referral thing that we've been doing, right? I got a buyer, Claire, that I think be really interested in your home. You want to send me some money and I'll get you connected with Douglas? And she says, well, hold up, Seth. I've done a couple of these referral things and I like them okay. But I tell you what, I'm really busy. And these referrals, they're taxing because I got to show them the home. I got to write up the offer. I got to do all this stuff. And, I'm paying you money. She's like, I'm going to make you a deal. I said, what you got, Claire? She said, why don't you come by my office and you pick up the keys and you show Douglas the home. And if you show Douglas the home and you write up the offer and you get him under contract, I'm going to sweeten the pot, Seth. Instead of 25%, I'll give you half of the commission. So would you charge 6%? She says, yeah, I'll give you half of it. You get 3%. So if you do all this work and it pans out, I'll give you half of it. I say, all right, Claire, daggone, let's do the thing, girl. And so what's going to happen? I'm going to throw Douglas in my car. I say, come on, Douglas. I'm going to see my buddy Claire, right? We're going to drive over to Claire's office. Claire's going to hand me the keys. Douglas and I are going to drive over to the listing. Claire's sign is going to be in the yard. Douglas and I are going to walk in. We're going to open the door. We're going to tour the house. And Douglas loves it. And Douglas wants to put an offer in. So I write up an offer for Douglas. And he gets accepted. And we go under contract. Now, folks, here's the thing I have to ask you. Who was I working for?
The buyer.
The seller.
The seller. There's no such thing as buyer agency yet. It didn't exist. But here's the question. Who did Douglas probably think I worked for?
Yeah.
Douglas was in my car, riding around with me. I was asking how his grandma was doing, how his kids were doing, right? This was back in the 50s, right? So Douglas and I stopped at McDonald's and got a 5-cent coffee, right? I bought it for him, right? Because I was a baller on a budget in my Cadillac station wagon back in the day, right? And we're just cruising along. I bought him coffee and we're just having a hoot and a holler, just chatting up, talking about all kinds of good stuff. And so who did Douglas think I worked for? He thought I worked for him. So this is where agency kind of evolved and turned into what it is now. Because there was a lot of confusion that happened in this time frame. Douglas and other buyers were confused. Agents were confused too because there was no such thing as buyer representation. Everybody worked for the sellers. But folks, don't you think I probably got confused as well? Because I knew Douglas's life story. I didn't meet that seller ever. Claire met them, but I didn't know him. So I probably thought I worked for Douglas too. So there was a huge lawsuit that happened, probably 80s. I think it was. It's not testable in any way, shape, or form, but you can look it up. It was called the Adena lawsuit. And there was a big brokerage firm that was doing exactly this. And it basically what happened is a buyer bought a house, realized that they were told that they had a sprinkler system or like a built-in sprinkler irrigation system. Turns out they did not. And so when they started digging, they realized that, the agents lied to them. And they were like, well, my agent lied to me. And an attorney was like, you didn't have an agent. You were a buyer. There is no such thing as agency. And so it turned into this huge class action lawsuit where all these buyers had this epiphany that they bought houses thinking they had representation, but they did not. And so the federal government took a look at real estate brokerage and agency, which was all on the state level at this point. And they said, y'all fix this or we will. Right? And when the federal government says that on the state level is like, oh, hell no, let's fix this, right? We don't want to deal with the federal government. So let me ask you the $1 million question. What is the easiest way to fix an issue where buyers thought they had representation, but they did not, and agents thought that they represented buyers, but they did not because buyer agency didn't exist? What's the easiest way to fix that?
Create buyer agency.
Create buyer agency. That's it. And so agency is kind of a very interesting concept. But I feel like I needed to give you this notion, this story, this base work to help you understand as we go into what it is now. Because what they ultimately did is exactly what you said. They created buyer agency, and the other thing they did is they started requiring disclosure of agency. We have to clearly state whom we represent and what options exist to the general public, because we needed everybody to be on the same page. So there's a terminology for what Douglas and I were doing. When I was driving around with Douglas and he thought I represented them, but I did not. That is what we call implied agency. My actions suggested that I worked for Douglas, even though I did not. And so when we're dealing with agency, I want to give you a little bit of differentiation between like a national concept and a state level concept. North Carolina practices what we call fiduciary brokerage. It's a very funny word. It's going to pop up on the slides in a minute. Fiduciary brokerage means position of trust. Okay? We owe certain things to our clients. We take agency very seriously in North Carolina. When you are our person, we are going to bat for you, and your interests come before our own. That is how North Carolina operates. There are some states that do not operate under fiduciary brokerage. They have what we call transactional brokerage or facilitating brokerage. And I promise this is all going to show up on slides. I just needed to talk you through some things first. In a facilitating or transactional brokerage relationship, you don't have loyalties to anybody. You are a paper pusher. You're a mediator. You look at the buyer and you say, what do you want to do? You look at the seller, you say, what do you want to do? And you don't really care about either one of them. It's just, let's get this thing to closing. In North Carolina, we care about whoever we're working for. And so there are only 3 options for representation in North Carolina. A broker or an agent, right? Let's say the agent. And here's the thing. When I say the word agent, I want your brain to go to firm, because I told you that's the default. Okay? So when I say agent, don't automatically go to licensee. Automatically go to firm. So the agent, meaning the firm, can represent the buyer. Well, if they're not representing the buyer, who's the other party they can represent?
The seller.
The seller. So your options are you're either representing the buyer or the seller or both in North Carolina. There is no realm where we can represent nobody. In North Carolina, we have to have a fiduciary relationship with somebody. Does that make sense? If we don't have a relationship with somebody, we're not in the real estate transaction. You don't have any business. So the thing about it is, as long as you're representing somebody, you can assist the people that you're not working with. So even though we have buyer agency now, would you agree that if I'm a listing agent, I may show a home to a buyer, even if I don't represent them, because it's in the best interest of my seller? But what I owe my seller, who's my client, and what I owe this buyer, who's a customer, are vastly different. Everybody following along so far? You're so smart. I love it. So, I think it's safe to put some slides up now, but I told you, I'm going to warn you, there's certain slides that I'm just going to say throw this crap out because it's not worth the headache that it causes, okay? It's just not. So when we're talking about agency, agency is what we have when we have a relationship with somebody. Folks, we've already talked about brokers, right? There's different types of brokers. There's stock brokers, mortgage brokers, real estate brokers, so on and so forth. But now we're getting into this word agent. An agent is just somebody who looks out for the best interest of somebody else. Do you think there's other agents out there aside from real estate agents? Give me some examples.
Insurance agents.
Insurance agent?
Life insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Sports agent.
Say it again?
Sports agent.
Absolutely. You think Cam Newton's got an agent? Not a good one. You think Tom Brady has an agent? You think Tom Cruise has an agent, right? Yeah. People have agents all the time. Folks, when you've got an agent, they're looking out for your best interest. Okay, let me give you an example of an agent relationship that's not us. Do you think that Tom Cruise just got the first offer that was sent to him to do Top Gun 2? Nah, right? They probably sent something to his agent and said, hey, Tommy boy, we'll give you $25 million to do Top Gun 2. And his agent said, my client won't do it for less than $225 million. You are smoking crack, right? And so they went back because the agent's looking out for the best interest of Tom Cruise. That's what an agent is. It's somebody who looks after other people. And so that's what we're doing in real estate transactions. If you are a buyer's agent, you're looking out for the buyer. If you're a seller's agent, you're looking out for the seller. So that's where I told you the nuance exists. You're getting a broker's license, not an agent's license. You're just called an agent because you represent the well-being of other people, buyers and sellers. So when we get into this, agency, I keep telling you, it's just a legal representation of one party by another party. That's all it is. Even if we don't call somebody an agent, sometimes that relationship exists. Even though we don't formally call them an agent, it's still a very similar relationship. I'll give you an example in just a second. But the agency relationship exists when two parties agree that one, meaning the agent, will act in the best interest of the other, which we call the principal or the client. Well, let me give you an example of an agent that you don't call an agent. If you're in court and you got an attorney, aren't they looking out for your best interest? We don't call them an agent, but they sure are. Now, even to the extent, let me give you a couple examples here of how you can associate this to real world stuff. Folks, do you have the option of going into court without an attorney and representing yourself?
Yes.
It's a dumb option, but it's an option, right? You could do it. It's probably not the best choice, right? But you can. So conversely, do you think that there are some times in real estate transactions that people don't have an agent? That they're representing themselves? Yeah, happens all the time. Sellers can sell their own home without an agent. We call them for sale by owners. Buyers can buy a house without an agent. We call them an unrepresented buyer. So an agent in any regard is just somebody who's looking out for the best interests of another, right? An attorney is a huge example. Folks, the other thing is agents are supposed to have some level of expertise, a professional, right? You're above and beyond. An attorney knows more about the law than you do. A real estate broker should know more about real estate transactions than the average person. Okay, so there's a lot of types of agents. Typically what it is the professional giving advice and walking you through what you need to be doing as the non-professional. And you're in a position where you rely and trust their advice. This is that fiduciary relationship that I keep saying. It's a position of trust. Well, folks, even if we don't call them agents, there's more examples. A coach is like an agent. Because, yeah, there's some skilled players on any basketball court, football court, or whatever. But the idea is the coach has even more knowledge to guide you, to help you make decisions. You're in that position of trust. It is looking out for the best interest of the non-professionals or the lesser professionals. That's what we do every single day as real estate agents. That's what Tom Cruise's agent does. That's what football coaches do. That's what attorneys do. They are looking out for their person. Now, let me help you understand something too, because it's very similar if you think back to that attorney thing, right? Folks, that's kind of the ironic thing about our legal system. When you're in this relationship, you've got to look out for their best interest no matter what. So if you ever watch these crime shows, right, it probably drives half of us nuts, right? Because these attorneys, like you got somebody who's obviously guilty of like a septuple homicide or some horrible, heinous crime, right? And what does that attorney have to do, right? They sit there with them and you talk to them and they say, oh yeah, I did it. I murdered all of them. Yep, cold blood. And they just sit there and they're like, the attorneys are like, shit, come on, man. Making my job so hard, right? Because they're still going to have to look after him and prove without a reasonable doubt. They're not going to tell their secrets, right? They got that client confidentiality. We have that too. Hopefully to a lesser degree, right? Hopefully our clients haven't murdered anybody and there's somebody in the basement, right? We're going to talk about something later called material facts. I think that'd be a material fact if there's like 6 dead bodies in the basement, but I digress, right? So that's what agency is. Agency is relationships, right? A professional giving advice to a non-professional in this relationship of trust. That's all agency is. So we're not the only agents that exist in the world, but it's because you represent other people that we call you a real estate agent. Because you're looking after somebody's best interest in a real estate transaction. Now, there's a lot of terminologies we can use. We can call you a broker. We can call you an agent. We can call you a licensee. I told you, realtor is a branded thing for a special organization called the National Association of Realtors. So let me make a statement here. All realtors are brokers, but not all brokers are realtors. It is something that you elect to become. Most of the time you don't have an option, but we still say you elect to become it. It's a special organization that you pay to be a member of. So here's where we also talked about the difference between a broker and a salesperson. And this is going to be most important on the differentiation between the national licensing exam and the state licensing exam. We do not have salespersons in North Carolina. We did once upon a time, but then we moved to what's called an all-broker state. So every single person in North Carolina is some type of broker. And I'm going to make another statement here. As a provisional broker in North Carolina, you're the equivalent of a salesperson in states that have salespeople. But in North Carolina, you can only be a provisional broker and play real estate for a maximum of 18 months. After 18 months, if you have not moved to a full broker, you can't play real estate until you do. In states that have salespersons, you can be a salesperson indefinitely. They're designed to always have supervision from a managing broker or just broker in those states, which would be basically the equivalent of our broker in charge.
So it's 18 months, within 18 months that we have to become a non-provisional
Broker.
license.
Yep.
Broker, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So when you get your license issued, the clock starts ticking. You have 18 months from the day that your license is issued to take 3 post-licensing courses in North Carolina. And those 3 post-licensing courses will move you to a non-provisional broker or a full broker. If you do not get those done within 18 months, your license will go back to inactive status and you can't play real estate anymore until you get it fixed. Yep. So this is just going into what I said, okay? In states that have salespeople, the brokers are considered a supervisory role because of the way that they have it set up. A lot of times they don't even use the term managing broker or BIC there. So the broker would be kind of the overseeing broker in a state with a salesperson. And the salesperson would be the equivalent of a provisional broker. In North Carolina, we have 3 tiers, right? We have provisional broker, we have full broker, and then we have a broker in charge. So in North Carolina, broker is not a supervisory. The only person that a broker, a full broker, could supervise is themselves. They could not supervise other licensees in North Carolina unless they were a broker in charge. And I promise, this is just day one. If you're feeling overwhelmed with all these different terminologies, they'll keep being repeated and repeated in different examples and contexts. So you'll get a better grasp on them as time goes on. So that's just a huge differentiation between the national test and the state test, right? We don't have salespersons in North Carolina. You will only see provisional brokers, full brokers, and BICs in North Carolina. And on the national side, you can see the word salesperson or just broker, sometimes called managing broker and employing broker. But they're basically the equivalent of a BIC in North Carolina. We've talked about firms. These slides are kind of, redundant with the other thing. And so I just want to remind you that a firm is an entity that's been created with the Secretary of State, right? That's the requirement. We've created something. That's why we call it a firm. Remember I told you, though, a firm could have one licensee, could have two, it could have 5,000. Okay, it's not about the number of people. It's the fact that an entity was created. Then a sole proprietorship means an entity was not created. You're doing business in your own name. But remember what I told you, a sole proprietor could also affiliate other brokers so long as they are a BIC. We're going to talk more about that when we get into some of the state license law and commission rule concepts. It's just reiterating what I said. I'm not a slide reader by any means. I just talk, and so sometimes you'll see like the slides then mirror what I just said because I didn't realize the slide was coming next, but I felt a good time to tell you, and then I'm like, oh yeah, there's that slide. But it's good because then it just reinforces you. Some of you like to just listen. Some of you like to see the slides and write it down. Whichever one you are, that's great. So a real estate firm can consist of one broker or many. I told you the key for it being a firm is, we created an entity. That's the firm. So in a nutshell, firms are just real estate brokers or groups of brokers that decided to structure some business other than a sole proprietorship.
So a provisional broker can start a firm, or cannot?
A provisional broker cannot start a firm. Only a full broker could. And here's the other thing, Sandeep. We haven't gotten into this yet because it's the advanced level stuff, but we will circle back around to it. A full broker starting a firm would have to hire a broker in charge because the requirements to be a broker in charge is 2 years of full-time brokerage experience. And so you have to have a broker in charge if you've created a firm that's going to be affiliating other brokers and advertising and doing all the normal duties. So while a full broker could start a firm, a full broker could not be a BIC until they meet the qualifications, but they could hire a BIC to start a firm.
Thank you.
Yep. So I think what happened is why these slides have been updated, they're trying to combine it because we've already seen these. So I'm skipping through these. Like I said, I wasn't sure what the updates were when he put these in here. So that's why I'm skipping over those. You've already seen those in those introductory slides. So when we're talking about this agency and clients versus customers, okay, our client or our principal is our boss. That's the way to look at it. Even though we're the professional, even though we're the advisors, they are the decision makers. We work for them. And we work for them by way of an employment agreement that we call an agency agreement or an agency contract. So it is very important in every transaction, in the real world and on a test, to know who works for who. You always need to be thinking about relationships between agreements, between parties, between scenarios, because the questions, the answers will all very much depend on the relationships. So if we're a seller's agent, that means we work for the seller. If we're a buyer's agent, that means we work for the buyer. So this next two slides are where I'm going to say, take it with a grain of salt, okay? I'm going to say something. I need you to trust me on it because if you let it happen, we will get, well, I'm not going to let it happen. I'm not going to let you get derailed here. But so many people have trouble with what I'm about to tell you. I just said, if you are a buyer's agent, you represent who?
Buyer.
The buyer. If you're the seller's agent, you represent who?
The seller.
The seller. So there are times that we use a different terminology than seller's agent or buyer's agent. But the way that these slides are written will drive you nuts if you let it. Okay? So let me explain something. If you are dealing with a seller's agent, we also call them a listing agent. So much so that the agreement that you sign to form a relationship with a seller is called a listing agreement. So if you see the word listing, the point of these slides is to tell you about actions. The action of working with this person or that person. And so these words are not supposed to indicate loyalties. It's just indicating actions. But I'm telling you right now that a listing agent always works for a seller. Even though what this slide is telling you is that listing means working with a seller, a listing agent always works for the seller. Does that make sense? But here's the caveat. This is the only thing that's important on this slide, in my opinion. If you... Where's my... Douglas, I'm still going to blow up Zoom. It never wants to write. I'm trying to write and it's not letting me do it. I was trying to underline this word selling. This word selling right here. Selling is a dangerous word. It is. Selling means assisting a buyer. It means working with a buyer. It does not mean working for anybody. And so think back to that beautician. If you're not their beautician, but you're assisting them, that's what we're talking about here. And so selling is not a strong enough word to tell you whom you represent. It just means I'm working with a buyer. So let me explain why this is important. If you were a buyer's agent representing a buyer, you're a selling agent. But if you are a listing agent, meaning working for the seller, and showing a buyer customer, somebody who is not your person, the home, you are also the selling agent. Selling does not have strong enough meaning to tell you who your loyalties are to. That is the biggest takeaway from this slide. Don't worry about listing. Listing always means loyalties to the seller, I promise. But selling does not tell you who you work for. We would need more information. Let me give you an example. If I said Heather is assisting a buyer customer as a selling agent, who are Heather's loyalties to?
The seller.
The seller. Because the buyer customer is not somebody we're looking out for. But if I say Heather is assisting a buyer client as the selling agent, who are Heather's loyalties to?
The buyer.
The buyer. You see how that word selling, it doesn't tell you anything. All it tells you is that you are assisting a buyer. It is not strong enough to tell you a relationship. So you would need other indicators. Let me show you one thing, and I'll post it into yours as well. Where is your Google Classroom? Let me show you something that I posted in the other one. Because my last class, they just went off the rails with this, and I had to like beat it into their heads that this is the only takeaway from this slide. And if you watch Travis's videos, he goes in a way, like he talks about it like it's a way bigger of a thing than it needs to be. And that's his prerogative. He can do that. I'm telling you, if you look right here, and I'll put this in your Google Classroom as well, right? Listing agent always works for the seller. Seller's agent always works for the seller. Buyer's agent always works for the buyer. Selling agent, we don't know. Selling is not strong enough. That is the biggest takeaway. It is not a strong enough word to tell you who your relationship is with. We would need to give you something else, like the word customer or client. That make sense? Yeah. Becky, I can't believe we just got through that in like 30 seconds. Remember how long it took us to explain that in the last class?
I do, and I have a theory why.
Yeah?
Everybody is hungrier for it.
Say what?
Everybody everybody here is hungrier.
Yeah, yeah, they're sharp. They're
It's a wonderful trait, and I admire it very much.
yeah. Some of the people in my last class just wanted to, just piss in the wind to see what happens, as they say, right? I'm like, all right, well, we can play that game, but we're gonna miss out on all the good information, folks. I appreciate you just trusting me on this, because trust me, this is the biggest takeaway from this slide. Okay. Selling is a dangerous word. It does not tell you who your relationship is with. Listing does tell you. Seller's agent does tell you. Buyer's agent tells you. But selling never tells you who your relationship is with. That is the biggest takeaway. Okay? That's why I hate this slide. This says listing is assisting the seller. Screw that. Listing means you represent the seller. It always does. There is never a realm that you are working with a seller and we call you a listing agent that you're not representing the seller. Let me give you the best example I can give you. I already told you that there are times when people don't use real estate brokers. Well, if I was working with Lawrence as a buyer client, right? Lawrence was my buyer client. My loyalties are to whom?
Lawrence.
Lawrence. And let's say Lawrence found a for sale by owner, a FSBO. And Christy was selling her house by herself. She's like, I'm so smart. I don't need an agent. I watch HGTV, right? And so she was selling her own house. And I took Lawrence and I gave Christy paperwork. You wouldn't call me a listing agent because I gave a for sale by owner paperwork. You see what I'm saying? So we don't need to discuss any realm that you're ever going to be using listing in any context other than representing the seller. But selling, we use it all the time to just say you brought the buyer or you're assisting the buyer. It's not strong enough to tell you your loyalties, who you're representing. You need other words for that. Oh, and it makes my heart so happy that y'all got this so easily, right? Y'all, we're gonna have a good group. Look, you laugh, Corbin. I mean, I had to edit out 2 hours worth of discussion from my last class because they just kept going. But Travis said, and this happened, and I said, I don't care. I'm telling you. This is the way it works. Like, this is all you need to know.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
As you said that, but so for an example of when it would be used, is it often or would it be used if, say, you're a listing agent? Is it commonly used when you help bring in buyers or?
Well, let me give you the most common context, Claire. A listing firm is paid 3% and the selling firm is paid 3%. In a commission style question, we really don't care who the loyalties are. And so the selling firm could have been a buyer's agent, or they could have been loyal to the seller as well, what we call a seller sub-agent. And so loyalties don't matter in that style of question. But we always call it, when we're doing commission splits, listing commission and selling commission, right? Listing firm, selling firm. It just typically is used in the context of you brought the buyer, but never in like a loyalty thing. So in other words, Claire is working with Seth, as a selling agent, and Seth is a buyer customer. And then it goes on to say, that you showed me the house and I want to put in an offer, and then it's going to ask who your loyalties are to. You're assisting me, so you are a selling agent. But because it said buyer customer, your loyalties are to who?
Buyer.
I'm the buyer, and I'm a customer, which means you don't owe me anything.
Okay.
So who's the only other person you can represent, Claire?
The seller.
Seller. So that's who your loyalties are to. That's exactly what you're going to see. Selling doesn't tell you who you work for. So that's where you got to look for that other word. Assisting a buyer makes you a selling agent, but does not make you a buyer's agent. Yeah.
I think one of the best things that I heard that helped me catch this, because it took me a while to get my mind around it, was that a builder building a new subdivision, you're working for the builder, but a buyer comes in and you assist them in showing them the house and selling the house to them. I'm still working for the builder.
That's exactly right.
Seller.
That's exactly right. I love that. Here you go. Jim, right here. An on-site builder representative works for the builder who has signed an agreement with Jim's office. So he is a listing agent because he is representing the builder, the seller. Okay? His loyalties are to the seller. But buyers come in, interested in the home, and he's showing the home. He is currently in the act of selling. Selling. I love the analogy. If you, this is where I like Travis's analogy. If you've ever been to Best Buy, most of you probably have. If you've ever been to Best Buy, what happens when you walk into a Best Buy?
A representative comes in.
Say it again.
A representative comes in.
There you go. Best Buy has like crazy amounts of customer service, right? Can I help you with anything today? Can I help you find anything? Can I explain anything to you, right? They're always in your face, right? But here's the thing. They're selling you something, right? They're trying to sell you something. You know who they work for. They're in bright blue shirts. Who do they work for?
Best Buy.
Best Buy. Their loyalties are to Best Buy, but they're in the act of selling. They're trying to sell you a product. Just like an on-site agent would be trying to sell you a house. Just like a listing agent. If you were an unrepresented buyer and you called it a listing agent, they're trying to sell you a house. They're not representing you. They're not loyal to you. You're not paying their paycheck, right? But they are selling you something. That makes them a selling agent. Does that make sense? Yeah. Listing agent always means working, because arguably Jim is both a listing agent and a selling agent. You know, Travis may argue that he's just in the act of selling, but he's currently a listing agent as well, because that's what we call you when you represent the seller. So he is a listing and selling agent simultaneously, because he does represent the seller, but he is currently assisting a buyer, which makes him selling right now. That's it. And I promise you, doesn't need to go any deeper than that between this listing versus selling. There's not enough questions on that word. You just got to be very careful with that word selling. That's the only word that is dangerous.
So you could also be a seller's agent and a selling agent.
Correct. Because seller's agent means you're loyal to the seller.
Right.
And a selling agent means you're assisting the buyer. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
So we've already talked about agency, right? Just this relationship that exists when one is authorized to act on behalf of the other. I told you, though, when we're dealing with agency and the word agent, okay, I want your brain to default to firm. ABC Realty, XYZ Realty, you know, so on and so forth. It's very important. So let's get into some of the other basic terminologies. Because agency is a relationship. I think you got that down. Principal and client, same person. When we are talking about the principal or the client, I told you, these people are the boss. They have hired us, and we are their agent, and we look after their best interests, right? Just like Tom Cruise's agent is looking out for Tom Cruise's best interests. We're looking out for them. Principal and client are synonyms for each other. And the default for, you know, agent is firm, and then principal and client could be a buyer, could be a seller, right? Could be both. We'll talk about that some more. Okay? Principal, client are synonyms. Customer is something completely different. Very important. Oh, some of you, I apologize. Sometimes, you know, I click through a little fast. If you ever need me to go back, I'm happy to do it. You just got to let me know. I'm watching some of y'all look like you're taking notes, so let me pause for a second. So, customer is everybody else that is not our client, okay? Customer is everybody else that is not our client. Now, here's where I'm going to be a little more specific than, and truth to be told, I've seen some of Travis's videos, but I mean, I don't really need to watch his class. I'm not trying to take the test. So I've seen some, and he's a good friend, and he's one of the best instructors I've ever met in my life. But we do teach certain things a little bit different. And so here's why I want to point out something to you, okay? I want to make sure that you understand customer is anybody that is not our client. But here's what I want you to know. Customer does not mean unrepresented. Let me explain. If Kelly hires me, and she's a buyer, and I'm her buyer's agent, who is my client?
Kelly.
Kelly. If Heather is hired by Lene to be a listing agent, we can all agree that Lene is Heather's client. But what is Lene to me?
Customer?
A customer. See how important that is? Customer is anybody other than your client. It does not automatically mean unrepresented because somebody else could be representing them. I promise you Scarlett Johansson's agent is different than Tom Cruise's agent. Okay? And that's okay. So customer doesn't mean unrepresented. It means you're not represented by me. And so if we're in a situation, and stupid pen probably still not working, which means I'm going to have to, oh, we're about to take a break anyway. I'll fix it when we're on break. Because I need to be able to draw this, right? I'm a very visual, I'm like scribble on the screen all the time. I'm like this, and this. It's important to understand that customer just means I'm not representing you. You're not my client. So you could have a customer, but they are somebody else's client. You could also have a customer that's unrepresented. That's where you need more terminology, right? Because if I was assisting an unrepresented buyer customer, we know that they don't have an agent. They're going it alone. But if I was, talking about somebody else's buyer client and I'm a listing agent, it's still a customer to me, but it's that person's client. Does that make sense? So customer is what we call everybody else who's not our client or our principal. Okay? That being said, go take a break. I'm going to see if I can fix my screen. 2:01 to 2:11, because it's already 2 o'clock. So I'll give you 2:01 to 2:11. Take a 10-minute. Then we're on the home stretch for day one. Work your way back. Get your cameras back on. In the home stretch for the day. So client and principal are synonyms for the boss, right? The person who hires us, the person we work for, the person we owe fiduciary duties to. We're going to talk about these fiduciary duties some more in a minute. Customer is everybody who is not our client. Folks, think about it for a second. Who do you think we may interact with in a real estate transaction that are not our clients?
What is it called? Inspectors?
Inspectors, absolutely. Who else?
The other agents?
Other agents?
The lender.
Lender?
The attorneys?
Attorneys?
The appraisers?
Appraisers? The other agent's clients, right? A lot of people on a day-to-day basis that we interact with, work with, participate with, but they're not our client, right? And so it is a very different list. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, when we're dealing with clients, we say we owe them, there's an acronym for it, it's called Old CAR. And that's going to come up in a minute. Okay, Old CAR is what we owe clients. Obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill and care. If we're dealing with customers, the only thing that we owe customers, in a nutshell, is honesty and fairness. We do not owe them any of those old car things, right? We just owe them honesty and fairness. And to even say that we owe them honesty and fairness is almost laughable, and you'll figure out why in just a moment. But that is the big differentiation between customers and clients. Oops. So when we continue with this terminology, I've already introduced both of these words to you, okay? Fiduciary brokerage is what we practice in North Carolina. That means we have responsibilities to people. We are looking out for their best interests. We are in a relationship of hope, of trust, okay? Expertise, where their well-being comes before our own. That is fiduciary brokerage. I told you transactional brokerage is where you don't have loyalties to anybody. You're not looking out for anybody. A transactional broker is just a paper pusher. Now, I'm going to give you kind of an interesting revelation, all right? Excuse me. If I asked you for an oversimplification of what you think a buyer's agent was supposed to do for a buyer, what would you tell me? An oversimplification. Make it. Tell me what you think they do like I'm stupid with a capital S. I ain't got no sense.
Get them the lowest price.
Love that. A buyer's agent is supposed to get a buyer under contract and get them the best deal possible. That makes sense, doesn't it? Wouldn't you agree? If you're looking out for their best interest, wouldn't that be your goal? Should. What about a seller's agent? Give me the same oversimplification for a seller's agent.
Get more money for the seller.
There you go. Sell their home for the most stinking money possible. You agree?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, here's the thing about North Carolina. I told you that you could represent the seller. And if you're not representing the seller, who could you represent?
The buyer or both?
There you go. The buyer or both. And so before we even get into the lesson, I want you to have this epiphany. If you're representing both, doesn't that mean you're looking out for the best interest of both? So if you just told me that the buyer's best interest is getting the best price and the seller's best interest is getting the most money, do you think there's a way that we can actually represent both and get them both the best possible outcome? Now, I'm shaking my head and saying no to agree with y'all, but at the end of the day, there is a way to do it, and I'm going to teach it to you down the road, but the most simple answer is no. If you owe fiduciary duties to the buyer and fiduciary duties to that seller in the same transaction, that's what we call dual agency. And so here's the ironic thing. North Carolina does not do transactional brokerage or what we call facilitating brokerage. Those mean the same thing. And so you will see the term transactional brokerage and facilitating brokerage on the national section of the test. If you saw it on the North Carolina section, it would be which of the following is not allowed in North Carolina or not practiced in North Carolina. But here's the funny thing. Even though we don't have it, for all intents and purposes, transactional brokerage and dual agency look very similar. The difference is a transactional broker owes loyalties to nobody. A dual agent owes loyalties to everybody. But still makes you kind of worthless, right? If you owe loyalties to everybody and wanting the best outcome for everybody, it's very hard to do that. Does that make sense for everybody? So fiduciary brokerage is what we practice in North Carolina. Transactional brokerage we do not practice in North Carolina. So let me introduce some other terminologies here for you for agency. The agent is the person who has been hired on behalf of the principal or the client. That is the person who is working on behalf of them. And the default for agent is the firm. Doesn't matter if they sign an agreement with Johnny, the licensee. If Johnny works for ABC, they've hired ABC. ABC is the agent. XYZ is the agent. Keller Williams is the agent. That is the default. Unless we're dealing with a sole proprietorship. If Johnny was a sole proprietorship and legally could do so, then Johnny could be the agent. But the default for any test question when you see the word agent is to think the brokerage firm. Now, this next terminology is sometimes confusing because of the context we can use it in. I'm hoping that my little history lesson will help you understand this a little bit. If we just say the word subagent, subagent literally translates to agent of the agent. And so let me give you an example. If I hired Johnny, who works for ABC Realty, who is my agent?
ABC.
ABC Realty. But understand that Johnny is a sub-agent of ABC Realty. Every single licensee affiliated with a brokerage firm would be a sub-agent of that firm. So let's go back to Tom Cruise. We all know that Tom Cruise's agent is trying to get the most money for Tom Cruise. Do you think Tom Cruise's agent probably has an assistant? Don't you think Tom Cruise's assistant also wants the best for Tom Cruise? Yeah. And so here's the big piece of this. If we've got ABC Realty, looks crazy, but you get the idea. ABC Realty. And Johnny, I'm just going to put, sorry, Johnny, I'm just going to call you John right now because I'm not trying to write out all that. Okay. If Johnny works for ABC Realty, and I'm a buyer, and I hire Johnny, we all know that who I've really hired is ABC Realty. But I am going to be working with Johnny on a day-to-day basis. Folks, a firm can't actually help me. Only extensions of the firm can actually help me, right? Because the firm's this fictitious thing. So yes, I'm going to be working with Johnny directly, but ultimately my agent is said to be ABC Realty. Well, here's another big piece of this. If Sherry and Sharika and Corbin all also worked for ABC Realty, they all also work for me. Because ABC Realty wants my best interest. Everybody is an extension of ABC Realty. You are all sub-agents of ABC Realty. Think of it like cells in your body. You know you have different types of cells, but we wouldn't call them anything different than just you, right? They're just part of you. Same thing too, if you're talking about a football team. Yeah, there's a lot of different people on a football team. But what do we call them? The Panthers, the Falcons, the Steelers. Because they're all doing the same thing. They have the same goal. To win. Does that make sense? So a sub-agent is just literally the agent of the agent. That's it. So if the agent's the firm, everybody who is affiliated with the firm, so we call you an affiliated licensee, is a sub-agent of that firm and acts as an extension of the firm. We don't really treat you anything different, right? Johnny's ABC Realty, Sherry's ABC Realty, Sharika's ABC Realty, Corbin's ABC Realty. That is what sub-agent means. Now let me throw you a curveball here. There is a differentiation, and I think a lot of instructors don't do a good job explaining this. So if you watch any videos, you may miss this, but this is an important distinction. There is another terminology called a seller sub-agent. That is something different than just a sub-agent in and of itself. Sub-agent means agent of an agent. A seller sub-agent means somebody else who also has loyalties to the seller. The reason why that's an important distinction is because if I was a seller, ABC Realty is the listing agent, the seller's agent, and every single one of these people is technically a seller sub-agent within their firm, but we just call them a sub-agent. But here's the big distinction, okay? Seller sub-agency can transverse firms. And this is advanced stuff, but I'm just going to give you an introduction and we're going to talk about it in more detail down the road, I promise. If a licensee was called by a buyer, and let's just throw Dylan over here, right? If Dylan worked for XYZ and a buyer called Dylan up and said, Dylan, I want to see 123 Main Street, okay? Well, 123 Main Street is listed by ABC Realty. Dylan meets the buyer, and the buyer says to Dylan, I don't need an agent. So let me explain something to you. If Dylan can't be the buyer's agent, who's the only other person Dylan could represent?
The seller.
The seller. Remember back in the day when people from different firms all worked for the sellers even though they didn't meet them? That still exists today. It's called seller sub-agency. So if Dylan met a buyer who said, Dylan, I don't need an agent, I just want to see this pretty house. The only way that Dylan could show him the house is if they had a relationship with the seller. And that would be called seller sub-agency. It is basically where a firm and the seller would allow another firm to also represent their seller. Because I told you in North Carolina, you have to represent somebody. So if Dylan can't represent the buyer, the only other person he could represent is the seller. So if the firm authorizes seller sub-agency, notice that it's a different firm. It's a special relationship called seller sub-agency. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. I just wanted to introduce it because I think a lot of people do a very poor job of explaining that there is a difference between just the word sub-agent and seller sub-agency or seller sub-agent. Does that make sense?
So basically, most realtors are sub-agents.
All brokers are sub-agents of their firm if they're affiliated with a firm. But most are not doing seller sub-agency. Here's the interesting thing, Claire. I have to teach you seller sub-agency because it's extremely testable. But seller sub-agency is actually exceptionally rare in the real world nowadays. Because why wouldn't somebody want exclusive representation, right? Why would you be unrepresented in a day and age when buyer agency is so prevalent? But it is a thing. You will never hear the term buyer sub-agent either, though, right? I mean, arguably, you would be a buyer sub-agent if you were in a firm that was the buyer's agent and everybody works there, but you're just never going to see that terminology for a buyer sub-agent. But seller sub-agent is this very special thing that we have to talk about, and it's very testable.
Is there any benefit to it, or what is the reason you would ever do it?
Because you have to represent somebody. And if some yutz out there was a buyer who did not want representation and they still wanted you to show them the house, the only way you can show them the house is by representing the seller.
And ABC could say, screw off, no, this is my listing. Or,
Yeah, they could. There's no obligation for them to have to do that. And so you're on something good here, Claire. If Dylan met this buyer and they said, I don't want an agent, I just want you to show me the house. And ABC Realty was not electing to do what we call seller sub-agency. Dylan's not in it. If Dylan can't represent the buyer or the seller, Dylan's going to go take a shot at tequila at the local bar, thank that buyer for wasting his time, and move on with his day. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or whiskey, whatever it is, Dylan. You know, pick your poison, right? I'd go for the whiskey first personally, and then tequila's a close second, right? You know, I don't judge.